The flame shouldn't exist. Kale stood in the temple ruins at midnight, staring at fire that burned violet instead of orange, that cast no heat yet lit the darkness with impossible brightness, that flickered and danced to rhythms that had nothing to do with wind or fuel or any natural law he understood. The flame had appeared 3 days ago in the exact center of the ancient altar, manifesting from absolute nothing, defying every principle of nature and magic that governed the known world. And it was growing. Each night it burned brighter, larger, more insistent, as if searching for something specific, or someone particular. The priests said it was a sign from forces long dormant. The scholars said it was physically impossible, and therefore couldn't be real, despite everyone seeing it. The king said nothing at all, just stood beside Kale in the ruined temple, and stared at the forbidden flame with an expression that cycled between fear and recognition and something else entirely, something Kale couldn't quite identify, but that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Kale was 23 years old and had been Omega of the Ashbourne Pack for his entire conscious life, which meant he occupied the absolute lowest rank possible in their rigid hierarchy, the position specifically reserved for those with no particular strength or gift or value worth acknowledging. In a society that prized power above absolutely everything else, being Omega meant being invisible by design, being last in every queue and every consideration, being the one who ate only after everyone else had finished and slept in whatever cramped space no one else wanted, and existed purely at the sufferance of those who actually mattered to the pack's survival and prosperity. It meant a life of constant service without recognition or gratitude, of endless work without reward or advancement, of mere survival without dignity or hope for anything better. But it was life, which was considerably more than some Omegas received in packs that were less tolerant of perceived weakness or uselessness. The Ashbourne weren't shapeshifters or lupins or any of the other familiar classifications that usually came to mind when outsiders thought about pack structures and hierarchies. They were something older and stranger, something that predated those more common categories by centuries or possibly millennia. They were flame-touched humans who'd been fundamentally changed by prolonged proximity to an ancient fire that had burned at the absolute heart of their territory for what the oldest records suggested was at least 1,000 years. The fire had gone out centuries ago, though no one currently living could remember exactly when or under what circumstances, or why it had chosen that particular moment to finally extinguish, but its transformative influence remained embedded in the bloodlines of those families who'd been closest to it during its long burning. They burned hotter than normal humans in ways that were measurable, could manipulate heat and flame in ways that seemed minor but were actually quite useful, were naturally resistant to fire that would kill anyone else. And their entire social hierarchy was determined completely and inflexibly by the strength of that inherited gift, by precisely how much flame each individual could control, and how intensely they could personally burn. Alphas like King Theron could create fire from absolutely nothing, could shape flames into weapons or shields or towering walls of heat with merely a thought, could burn so extraordinarily hot that standing within 20 feet of them during a display of power was genuinely painful, even for other flame-touched individuals who had considerable heat resistance. Betas, the middle rank, could control and redirect existing flames with impressive precision, could sense and manipulate heat in sophisticated ways, could use fire as a versatile tool for building or destroying or transforming materials in ways that made them valuable to the pack's survival. And Omegas like Kale had almost nothing worth mentioning. He could light candles if he concentrated intensely for several minutes, could make his hands warm enough to be marginally useful during cold weather, could sense nearby heat sources in a vague and generally useless way, but couldn't do anything meaningful with that awareness. It was barely a gift at all, just enough to mark him as technically flame-touched, but nowhere near enough to make him valuable to anyone or worthy of respect or consideration. He worked in the temple, cleaning and maintaining the extensive ruins that had once been the absolute center of Ashbourne worship and spiritual life, back in those distant days when they'd still believed the ancient flame was divine rather than just conveniently useful. The temple was genuinely ancient, built from massive blocks of black stone that had somehow been shaped by intense heat rather than conventional tools, with intricate carvings covering every surface that showed the original flame in all its alleged glory and power. The carvings depicted a massive pillar of light reaching impossibly high toward the sky, burning without any visible fuel source, eternal and unchanging, and somehow alive in ways the artists had struggled to capture in stone. It had been the absolute heart of everything the Ashbourne had been in those distant days before it went out, and they became just another struggling pack trying to survive in a world that didn't particularly care about their history, or their diminished gifts, or their fading relevance. 3 days ago, while Kale was performing his usual morning cleaning of the altar in the early hours when no one else was ever around to see him working, the flame had appeared without any warning whatsoever. One moment the altar was completely empty, just cold stone that hadn't held any fire in several centuries, covered in accumulated dust and bird droppings and all the various debris of long abandonment and neglect. The next moment, violet flames were dancing energetically in its exact geometric center, burning with an intensity that made him step backward so fast he nearly fell over his own feet. That made his pathetically weak gift suddenly flare in response for the very first time in his entire life. That called to something buried deep inside him that he hadn't known existed until that precise transformative moment. He'd run frantically to find the priests, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement and something else he couldn't begin to name, had practically dragged them back to witness the impossible thing happening in their long-dead temple. And word had spread through the pack with remarkable speed, bringing absolutely everyone, from the lowest Omega to the highest Alpha, all 300 members of the Ashbourne pack gathering together to stare in wonder and confusion at the flame that shouldn't exist, but undeniably and impossibly did. The king had arrived on the second day of the flame's mysterious appearance. Theron, who ruled not just the Ashbourne pack, but all flame-touched territories across 3 separate kingdoms, widely acknowledged as the most powerful fire-wielder born in at least 1,000 years, according to the historians who carefully tracked such things. He was physically enormous, standing nearly 7 feet tall, even without his usual boots, with shoulders so broad they seemed almost unnaturally wide, broad enough to carry the weight of an entire people's survival and future. His hair was the precise color of flame itself, an impossible mixture of red and gold and copper that somehow all blended together naturally, falling past his shoulders in thick waves that seemed to move and shift even when he stood perfectly motionless. His eyes were pure amber, bright enough to glow noticeably in dim light, like an animal's eyes reflecting firelight, and his skin carried a permanent warmth that made the air shimmer and waver around him in ways that were clearly visible even to those without any flame-touched gifts at all. He could create massive walls of fire with a single focused thought, could burn hot enough to melt solid stone into flowing glass, could sense heat signatures from literally miles away, and distinguish precisely between a deer moving through the forest and a human approaching with hostile intent. He was power incarnate, authority made physical flesh, and he'd ruled for 20 years with the kind of absolute certainty that came from being unquestionably the strongest person in any room or situation he ever entered. He'd stood before the violet flame for many consecutive hours on that second day, studying it with an intensity that made absolutely everyone else uncomfortable and nervous, trying desperately to understand what it was and why it had appeared after centuries of absence and what exactly it wanted from them. He'd attempted to control it using the same techniques he used to control all other fire, had reached out with his considerable and legendary gift to shape it or redirect it, or at least understand its fundamental nature and composition. And the flame had rejected him completely. It hadn't burned him or lashed out in anger or defense, had simply refused to respond to his power in any way whatsoever, as if his tremendous gift meant absolutely nothing to it at all, which should have been completely impossible. Theron could control literally any flame anywhere within his considerable range, had proven that countless times in formal demonstrations and actual battles in the daily exercise of his authority as king. But this flame was fundamentally different. This flame was wrong in ways that made even experienced fire-wielders deeply nervous. This flame was forbidden, though no one could quite articulate exactly why that particular word kept appearing in their minds when they looked at it. Cale had been present for all of it, not because anyone particularly wanted him there or valued his input or observations, but simply because the temple was his assigned responsibility and no one had bothered to send him away or exclude him. He'd watched carefully from the shadows where Omegas naturally belonged, staying as quiet and unobtrusive as possible, as alphas and scholars and priests tried desperately to understand the violet flame, as they debated endlessly what it meant and where it could possibly have come from, and what should be done about it. The overwhelming majority wanted it extinguished immediately, wanted this impossible and uncontrollable thing removed before it caused problems they couldn't predict or prevent or manage. But no one could extinguish it no matter what they tried. Water evaporated instantly before even touching the flames, turning to steam with a sharp hiss that sounded disturbingly like mocking laughter. Dirt and sand wouldn't stick to it at all, sliding off the violet fire as if the flames existed in a completely different dimension than normal physical matter. And desperate attempts to smother it with heavy cloths resulted in the cloths themselves catching fire and burning with the exact same violet flames, effectively spreading the impossible fire rather than containing or controlling it in any way. On the third night, Theron stood completely alone with Cale in the temple ruins, both of them staring in silence at the flame that had grown steadily from the approximate size of a candle flamed to the substantial size of a bonfire. A king had dismissed absolutely everyone else several hours earlier, had sent even his closest advisers and most trusted enforcers away, despite their obvious reluctance to leave him alone with the flame, and now it was just the most powerful alpha in all the territories, and the weakest omega in the entire pack, standing together in darkness lit only by impossible violet fire that shouldn't exist. Cale didn't understand at all why he'd been specifically allowed to stay when everyone else had been sent away, didn't dare ask for clarification, just remained as silent and invisible as he possibly could in the way Omegas were trained from childhood, to be in the presence of their obvious betters. "You feel it, don't you?" Theron's voice suddenly broke the silence that had stretched comfortably for nearly an hour, startling Cale so badly he almost fled the temple entirely out of pure instinct. The king wasn't looking at him directly, was still staring intently at the flame with an expression that cycled unpredictably between fascination and frustration, but the question was clearly and unmistakably directed at Cale specifically. "Feel what, Alpha King?" Cale's voice came out barely above a whisper, rough from disuse and from fear of saying the wrong thing. "The pull," Theron said, still not looking away from the flame. "The flame isn't just burning randomly. It's calling, actively searching for something specific, and you can feel it responding to you in particular, even though you're trying very hard to hide that fact from me, and probably from yourself as well." Cale wanted desperately to deny it, wanted to say he felt nothing unusual or remarkable, wanted to be invisible and unremarkable and safe in his complete insignificance. But he'd never been able to lie convincingly, not even as a small child, and lying directly to a king seemed like exactly the kind of catastrophic mistake that would have consequences he absolutely couldn't survive. "I feel something," he admitted reluctantly, his voice shaking slightly with fear. "Like the flame somehow recognizes me, even though that's completely and utterly impossible. Like it's been waiting for a very long time, and I'm specifically what it's been waiting for all these years." He hesitated, then added, because honesty seemed considerably less dangerous than partial truth or evasion, "But that doesn't make any sense at all. I'm Omega. I can barely light candles on a good day with optimal conditions. Why would a flame this powerful, this impossible, this ancient possibly care about someone as weak and useless as me?" Theron finally looked directly at him, and the weight of those amber eyes was almost physically painful. "That's exactly what I'm trying desperately to understand," he said with obvious frustration. "Every gift we have responds predictably to hierarchy. The strongest flames always answer to the strongest wielders. That's how it's always worked, how it's supposed to work according to every text and every tradition we have going back centuries. But this flame doesn't care about hierarchy at all, doesn't respond to power the way power should logically work. It appeared in a temple that's been completely dead for centuries, in the direct presence of an Omega who shouldn't matter to anyone or anything, and it's been growing steadily ever since you specifically found it. Almost like it's feeding on something we don't understand or can't perceive with our normal senses." He took a step closer to Cale, and the intensity of his presence was almost overwhelming, like standing far too close to a bonfire. "The priests say this is the original flame returning after all these centuries," he continued. "The fire that burned here 1,000 years ago, that made the ash burn what we are today, that gave our distant ancestors the gifts we still carry in our blood. They say it went out when we collectively forgot why it mattered, when we started using our gifts primarily for personal power instead of communal purpose, when rigid hierarchy became more important than genuine service. And now it's back after all this time, but different somehow, changed by centuries of absence. And it's calling to you specifically, completely ignoring every single alpha and beta in the entire pack. He paused significantly. Why? What do you have that I don't? What does this ancient flame see in an Omega that it apparently can't find in a king? I genuinely don't know, Cale said honestly, fear making his heart race uncomfortably. Alpha King, I'm nobody at all. I have no power worth mentioning, no gifts that anyone values, absolutely no reason for anything important to notice me or care about my existence. If the flame is calling to me, it absolutely has to be making some kind of terrible mistake. There are literally hundreds of Ashborn more worthy, more powerful, more capable of whatever it needs done. Then go to it, Theron said, his voice carrying a challenge but also unmistakable, genuine curiosity. If you're right, if you're truly not what it wants, the flame will ignore you completely the way it's ignored me and everyone else who's attempted to approach it. But if the priests are right, if this really is the original fire returning and choosing you specifically, for reasons we don't understand yet, then something absolutely fundamental about our understanding of hierarchy and power is completely wrong. And I need to know which it is before this flame does something we can't possibly control or reverse. Cale stared at the king, searching desperately for any sign that this was some kind of test or trap, that approaching the flame would result in immediate punishment for presumption. But Theron's expression held only genuine curiosity, mixed with something that might have been concern, or might have been fear, or might have been both. He really wanted to know, needed to know with obvious urgency, was willing to risk his weakest Omega approaching a forbidden and impossible flame just to understand what was happening in his territory. Cale looked at the violet fire, at the impossible thing burning without any fuel on an altar that had been completely cold for centuries, and felt the pull Theron had mentioned. It was absolutely real. It was remarkably strong. It was completely undeniable. And it was calling to him specifically, calling with an urgency that seemed to grow with each passing moment. He walked toward the altar slowly and carefully, each step feeling considerably heavier than the last, as if he were walking through water that got progressively deeper and more resistant the closer he got to the flame. The violet fire grew noticeably brighter as he approached, the light intensifying dramatically until it was almost blinding, forcing him to squint against the intense glare. He could feel heat now, not the burning kind that would damage flesh and leave scars, but something else entirely different. Something that resonated deeply in his chest rather than on his skin, that made his pathetically weak gift flare and pulse in ways it never had before in his entire life. When he finally reached the altar's edge, close enough to touch the stone if he simply reached out, the flames surged dramatically upward, forming a tall column of violet fire that reached toward him unmistakably like a living thing, extending a hand or tentacle. And then it touched him. Not physically, not in any way that would leave burns or marks or any visible evidence of contact. But it reached into him, past skin and muscle and bone, directly into the place deep inside where his weak and pathetic gift lived like a dying ember, barely clinging to existence. And it ignited something. Power flooded through Cale's entire body, more power than he'd ever imagined existing anywhere in the world, let alone inside his own flesh. The violet flame poured into him, through him, becoming part of him in ways that felt both completely natural and utterly alien simultaneously. His vision went pure white with light so bright it should have burned his eyes. His body went rigid with energy that should have torn him apart, and he felt himself actually lifted off the ground by forces he couldn't comprehend or control or even fully perceive, suspended in air that felt thick as honey. He heard Theron shouting something urgently, heard the king's voice calling his name with an edge of genuine panic that should have been impossible for someone that powerful. Felt strong hands grab his arms, desperately, trying to pull him back from the flame, trying to break whatever connection had formed between Omega and impossible fire. But absolutely none of it mattered. None of it could stop what was happening. The flame had found what it had been searching for across centuries of patient waiting, and it was claiming Cale completely and absolutely and irreversibly. Images flashed through his mind faster than conscious thought could possibly process. The original flame burning at the absolute heart of this temple, when the building was new and whole and sacred. Priest tending it with reverence and genuine love, understanding that it was alive, was conscious, was far more than just fire. The Ashborn gathering around it in those ancient days, receiving gifts not as payment or reward, but as true partnership, the flame sharing its power freely with those who respected it, rather than those who tried to control or exploit it. Generations of balance, of mutual support and genuine cooperation, of humans and flame existing in harmony that benefited both equally, and then the gradual change. Slow at first, then accelerating. Alpha starting to see the flame as a resource to exploit rather than a presence to respect. Taking progressively more than they gave, demanding rather than asking, treating the sacred fire as a tool for personal advancement instead of communal strength. The flame withdrawing, first slowly and reluctantly, then faster as the corruption spread like disease, going out completely, not because it died, but because it consciously chose to leave rather than be corrupted by what the Ashborn were becoming. And now it was back, not to restore what had been, because that past was gone forever and couldn't be retrieved, but to correct what had gone so terribly wrong, to offer one final chance for the Ashborn to remember what they were supposed to be, to find someone who could carry its power without being corrupted by it, who could help rebuild partnership rather than perpetuate exploitation, who could transform the flame touched into what they were originally meant to be instead of what they'd become. And it had chosen Cale, not despite his weakness, but specifically because of it. Because being Omega meant he'd never had power to corrupt him, never had strength to make him arrogant, never had authority to make him believe he deserved more than others. He was unmarked potential, someone who could learn to use power correctly, because he'd never had the opportunity to misuse it. The vision ended abruptly, and Cale fell hard. He would have hit the stone floor with enough force to break bones if Theron hadn't caught him, impossibly strong arms supporting his entire weight as he gasped desperately for breath and tried to process what had just happened to him. The violet flame had returned to the altar, burning steadily and calmly as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, but Cale could still feel it inside him. Not as something external or foreign, but as part of himself now, integrated into his being as completely as his own heartbeat. His gift, which had been barely a pathetic spark his entire life, now blazed like the sun itself. He could feel every heat source within miles, could distinguish precisely between the warmth of living bodies and the heat of fires and the residual warmth of stones that had been in sunlight. He could create fire from absolutely nothing just by willing it to exist. He could shape flames with thought alone. He could burn with intensity that rivaled or possibly exceeded Theron's legendary power. The Omega, who could barely light candles, could now create infernos. What happened? Theron's voice was strained with barely controlled fear, his arm still holding Cale upright because Cale's legs had turned to complete water. What did it do to you? What did you let it do? Cale tried to stand on his own, found that his legs were shaking badly, but mostly functional if he concentrated. It gave me everything, he said, his voice sounding strange in his own ears, resonant in ways it had never been before. Its power, its knowledge, its purpose and history and accumulated memory. He looked up at the king, at this Alpha who'd ruled with absolute certainty for 20 years and was now staring at his Omega with undisguised fear. It chose me to be its vessel, to carry what it was and help restore what we've lost. It chose me specifically because I'm Omega, because I have absolutely no reason to abuse power, since I've never had power to abuse. Theron stared at him in silence for a long moment, and Cale watched several emotions cycle rapidly across the king's face. Fear, definitely. Anger, possibly. Confusion, certainly. And something else that might have been recognition or acceptance or resignation. You're saying the flame made you what, exactly? Equal to me? Stronger than me? Something that doesn't fit into our hierarchy at all? Cale felt the power moving inside him, settling into patterns that felt both natural and completely unprecedented. I don't know what I am now, but I know I'm not Omega anymore. I'm something else. Something the flame needed me to become to accomplish what it came back to do. For several heartbeats, Cale thought Theron might kill him right then and there, might eliminate this obvious threat to the established order before it could grow or spread or challenge his authority. But the king just released him carefully and stepped back, his expression shifting through several stages before settling on something that looked like weary resignation. "Show me," he said quietly. "Prove that the flame really gave you power rather than just burning you from the inside until you eventually collapse and die." Cale hesitated only briefly, then held out his right hand, palm up. Violet fire appeared instantly, dancing and flickering with the same impossible beauty as the flame on the altar. He shaped it without conscious thought, forming it into a sphere, then a blade, then a bird that flew around the temple ruins before dissolving back into pure energy. The power responded to his will instantly and perfectly, as if he'd been wielding it his entire life rather than for approximately 3 minutes. Theron watched the demonstration with an expression that was difficult to interpret, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. When Cale let the flames dissipate completely, the king laughed once, a sound with absolutely no humor in it. The priests were right. The original flame returned after 1,000 years of absence, and it chose you. An Omega, the weakest, most insignificant member of the entire pack. He shook his head slowly. Every single alpha in all the territories is going to completely lose their minds when they hear about this. Every certainty we've built our society on for generations just got challenged by a flame that apparently doesn't care about our carefully constructed hierarchies or our understanding of how power should work. He moved to sit heavily on the temple steps, as if his legs could no longer support his weight, suddenly looking exhausted despite his legendary strength and endurance. For 1,000 years, he said to the empty air as much as to Kale, we've operated on the fundamental principle that power determines worth, that alphas lead because we're the strongest, that betas follow because they're useful, and that omegas serve because they're weak and have nothing else to contribute. And now a force older than any of us, older than our pack, or our traditions, or our entire way of life, is saying that's wrong, that an omega can carry power an alpha can't even touch, that our entire structure, everything we've built and believed and passed down through generations, is founded on assumptions that don't actually matter to the force that originally gave us our gifts. Kale sat beside him cautiously, uncertain if this familiarity was acceptable, but feeling instinctively that it was the right action. The flame showed me memories, he said quietly. How the Ashborn used to be before hierarchy became the only thing that mattered to us. We were partners with the flame then, not masters of it. It shared power with everyone freely, not just with the strongest or most aggressive. And when that changed, when alphas started hoarding power and treating the flame as a resource to exploit for personal gain, it left us. It went out not because it died or was destroyed, but because it refused to participate in what we were becoming. So it's back to correct us now. Theron's voice carried bitter understanding. To punish us for forgetting what we were supposed to be? Or maybe to give us another chance, Kale said, feeling the flame's purpose flowing through their connection. It doesn't want punishment or revenge. It wants restoration. It wants the Ashborn to remember what we were supposed to be from the beginning. A people who use fire to serve and protect rather than dominate and control. And it chose me because I've never had the chance to forget that lesson. Because being Omega meant I never thought I was entitled to power. Never believed I was superior to anyone. Never had the luxury of forgetting what it's like to exist at the bottom of a hierarchy that treats you as worthless. He looked at Theron directly, no longer afraid of meeting the king's eyes. The flame wants partnership again, with all of us, not just with me. But that requires alphas like you to give up the absolute power you've held for your entire reign and share it with people you've been taught your whole life to see as beneath you. It requires building a hierarchy based on contribution and service rather than dominance and strength. It requires remembering that our fire is a gift we were given, not a right we earned or can demand. And if we refuse? Theron asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. If I refuse to transform everything I've built, everything every king before me built, what happens then? Kale felt the answer through his connection to the flame, felt its certainty and its absolute commitment to this final chance. Then it leaves again, goes out permanently this time, and the Ashborn become just normal humans with no gifts, no fire, no reason to exist as a distinct people. We get one more opportunity to do this correctly. Just one. And if we fail again, if we choose hierarchy over partnership, the flame won't return a third time. This is our last chance." Theron sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, processing this ultimatum from a force that didn't negotiate or compromise, or care about human convenience. Finally, he looked at Cale with an expression of profound exhaustion. "What do you need from me? You're carrying the flame's power now, speaking with its authority, representing forces I can't touch or control. What does it want me to do?" Cale hadn't expected the question, hadn't anticipated that Theron would yield so quickly or so completely. But he could see the king was serious, was genuinely willing to set aside his own authority in service of something larger than himself. "The flame wants you to lead differently," he said carefully. "To see your pack members as partners rather than subjects. To use your considerable strength to protect rather than dominate. To remember that being alpha means serving the pack's needs, not ruling over them for your own benefit." "That's asking me to dismantle everything I've built," Theron said, but without the anger Cale had expected. "Everything every alpha before me built for generations. Our entire structure is based on the principle that strength determines who leads. If I abandon that foundation, chaos follows." "Maybe," Cale said, feeling certainty flowing through him from the flame. "Or maybe what you've been calling order is actually just comfortable oppression. Maybe the chaos you fear is just people having voices they've been systematically denied. Maybe real leadership means being secure enough in yourself that you don't need others to be weak for you to feel strong." Theron's jaw clenched, and for a heartbeat Cale thought he'd pushed too far, that the king would reassert his authority through violence, the way alphas had always done. But then something shifted visibly in Theron's expression and posture. The tension drained from his shoulders. The defensive anger faded from his eyes, and he did something that no one watching would have believed possible, even if they saw it with their own eyes. He stood slowly, deliberately, took 2 measured steps forward until he was directly in front of where Cale sat, and dropped to his knees. The king was kneeling before the Omega. The most powerful alpha in 1,000 years was bowing to the weakest member of his pack. It was impossible. It was heretical. It was the most profound statement of transformation that anyone in Ashbourne history had ever witnessed. Cale froze, completely paralyzed by the sight, unable to process what was happening in front of him. Theron looked up at him, amber eyes meeting violet-tinged gaze, and spoke with a voice that carried across the temple ruins and seemed to echo in dimensions beyond the physical. "I yield," he said formally, ritually, as if speaking an oath that would bind him forever. "Not to you personally, Cale, son of no one, Omega of the Ashbourne, but to what you carry, to the flame that chose you, that marked you, that made you its vessel and voice. I yield to the truth that power without partnership is just tyranny with a prettier name, that strength without wisdom is destruction waiting to happen, that leadership without humility is simply domination that we've agreed to call something more acceptable." He bowed his head deeply, exposing his neck in a gesture of complete submission. "Teach me. Show me how to lead the way the flame wants us to lead. Help me become the alpha our people actually need rather than the one they've been too afraid to question. I kneel because standing means clinging to certainty that was always wrong, and I choose to be better, even if it means admitting I've been failing for 20 years. The words hung in the air, like a binding contract, like prophecy made manifest, like the most important oath ever spoken by anyone in the long history of the flame-touched people. Kale felt the flame responding inside him, felt it recognize Theran's sincerity and genuine willingness to transform. This was exactly what it had been waiting for. Not an Omega to replace alphas in the hierarchy, but an alpha willing to completely reimagine what leadership could mean. A king strong enough to kneel, powerful enough to yield, secure enough to admit fundamental mistakes, and committed enough to do the hard work of becoming better. "Stand up," Kale said, his voice steady despite the emotional chaos inside him. "You don't need to kneel to me or to anyone. What you need to do is stand beside me as an equal partner. Work with the flame rather than trying to command or control it. Help rebuild what we've lost by being the first alpha in generations to remember that strength exists for service, not domination." Theron stood slowly, and Kale could see transformation happening in real time. The king who'd entered the temple had been certain, powerful, unquestioned in his authority. The king who stood now was still powerful, but fundamentally changed at his core, humbled, opened, willing to learn rather than simply command. "How do we begin?" Theron asked, the question genuine rather than rhetorical. "The flame showed me the old ways, but I don't know how to translate ancient knowledge into modern practice that our people will actually accept. I need you. Your experience, your understanding of how the pack actually functions day to day, your knowledge of what we've become and what needs to change. I can carry the flame's power, but you can help me use it wisely rather than just wielding it." Over the following weeks and months, they worked together tirelessly to transform the Ashbourne from a rigid hierarchy into something more balanced and sustainable. It wasn't easy. It was never easy. Alphas resisted violently, unable to imagine sharing power they'd held absolutely for their entire lives. Betas were confused and uncertain, struggling to navigate structures that were changing too quickly to track or understand. And Omegas were terrified, convinced this was some elaborate trap, that they'd be punished severely for daring to believe that things could actually be different. But Kale and Theron persisted together, leading by consistent example, showing daily that partnership was possible, even between the highest and lowest ranks. The violet flame remained on the altar through all of it, burning steadily and unchanging, serving as a visible reminder of what they were all working toward. It grew noticeably brighter when the Ashbourne made genuine progress toward partnership. It dimmed ominously when they backslid into old patterns of dominance and exploitation. It was judge, teacher, and guide all at once, the conscious force that had returned specifically to save a people who'd lost their way so completely they couldn't find it back without help. They established new laws carefully and thoughtfully. Omegas gained rights and protections they'd never had, including voices in decisions that directly affected them. Alphas had their authority significantly limited, required to justify commands rather than simply issuing them, held genuinely accountable for how they used their considerable strength. Betas evolved into mediators and translators rather than just followers, helping bridge the gap between those above and below them in the old hierarchy. It was messy and imperfect and constantly challenged from every direction, but it was real growth, fundamental transformation of what it meant to be Ashbourne. Not everyone could accept the changes. Some alphas left entirely, unwilling to share power they believed was theirs by natural right. Some betas struggled with the ambiguity of new roles that didn't have clear definitions yet. And some omegas couldn't overcome lifetimes of conditioning that taught them they were worthless. But enough people embraced the transformation that momentum built steadily, that the changes started feeling less like temporary impositions and more like permanent corrections that should have happened generations earlier. 6 months after the flames' return, Kale stood in the temple before an assembly of the entire pack. He still wore the simple clothes of an Omega, still lived in modest quarters, still saw himself fundamentally as the person he'd been rather than the flame-bearer he'd become. But the pack saw him completely differently now. They saw the violet fire that danced in his eyes when he spoke with the flame's authority. They saw the power he wielded with a gentleness that came directly from remembering powerlessness. They saw in him the possibility of being more than the rigid roles they'd been assigned at birth. Theron stood beside him, not behind and not in front but beside, equal in importance though different in function. The king had changed profoundly over those 6 months, had learned to lead through inspiration and example rather than command and threat, had discovered to his surprise that power shared actually became stronger rather than weaker, and he'd earned a kind of respect that was freely given rather than maintained through fear, which felt infinitely more valuable than anything he'd held before. Together, the Omega and the King stood as living proof that the Forbidden's flame had returned not to destroy, but to transform, not to punish, but to offer one final chance for the Ashborn to remember what they were always supposed to be. And in the temple rooms where it had all begun, the violet flame burned on steadily, waiting and watching and sustaining the partnership it had chosen to restore against all odds and expectations. Every hidden soul carries a fire that breaks rules, awakens kings, and bends destiny. If you've ever been the Omega who wasn't supposed to matter, if you've ever carried power you didn't ask for and weren't qualified for, but wielded anyway, because someone or something chose you specifically, if you've ever watched the powerful kneel before truth they couldn't control or manipulate, share your story in the comments below. Let this be a space where the unseen become essential, where Forbidden's flames find their unlikely vessels, where kings learn that true strength sometimes means kneeling, when kneeling serves truth better than standing. Remember to leave a like if this story reminded you that the weakest are sometimes chosen for the greatest purposes precisely because of their weakness, that real power comes from remembering what powerlessness feels like, that the most profound transformations happen when those who have everything are willing to yield to those who have nothing. And subscribe to walk this path with others who know that Forbidden's flames burn brightest in the hearts of the unlikeliest people, that kings who can kneel are stronger than kings who never question themselves, that sometimes the entire hierarchy needs to be challenged by forces far older than human certainty or comfort.